Hello, this is Kristofarova. Welcome to another episode of the Strategy Skills Podcast. Our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It is a free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And if you're preparing for interviews and want to make your resume better, get McKinsey and BCG winning resume. It is a resume that got offers from both McKinsey and BCG, also free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. And today we are speaking to Jeff Wetzler. Jeff is a co-CEO of Transcend, a nationally recognized innovation organization, and an expert in adult learning and human potential. Jeff combines unique leadership experiences spanning more than 25 years in business and education, as a management consultant to the world's top corporations, a learning facilitator for leaders around the world, and as Chief Learning Officer at Teach for America. Jeff, so great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So, what is the ask approach? Maybe that is a good place for us to start.
Awesome. The ask approach is a methodology that I have both learned from many others and synthesized and added to myself that really tries to tackle one single problem. And it's a problem that I think all of us encounter in our work and our lives, which is that the people around us hold in their hearts and minds a lot of ideas and information and experiences and thoughts and perspectives and feedback that too often we never find out. And we never find out because they don't tell us. And so the ask approach is a method to really tap into the most valuable things that others are thinking and feeling, but not saying to us, and to do it in a way that benefits both people, that helps you come together with another person to make better decisions together, to innovate better together, to deepen your relationship together, to save time together. And I can go into what are the steps or the practices of the ask approach, but at a high level, that's what it is.
I think that before we go into the steps, maybe we could cover what kinds of information do people withhold and why?
Yes. So in writing this book called Ask, I spent a lot of time researching and listening and talking to people to try to uncover what are the most common patterns of information that the people around you might be withholding from you, for all kinds of understandable reasons. And it includes a few things. One, for example, is challenges and struggles that they're having. And so I will say literally today, I was just talking to somebody on my team who was telling me that there's something very important in her life and in her career that she was dealing with on her own for the last year, and didn't feel like it was her place, or that it was the right thing to tell me about that. And finally, she told me now. And I thought to myself, wow, if I had known 6 months ago or a year ago, how helpful could I have been to you? So that's one category. A second category is what they really think about a topic or an issue, and where those views come from. There's a lot of really interesting research that talks about how prevalent, like upwards of 70% of managers surveyed say there is some concern or some opinion they have about an issue that they're not surfacing, they're not elevating for all kinds of reasons as well. And so sometimes people just don't come out and tell you what they're actually thinking, or sometimes they'll tell you what they're thinking, but they're not telling you where it comes from. What are all the things that they're seeing that lead them to that? So that's number two. Number three is their most important feedback for you. So their observations of how you do, what you're doing well, what you could be doing better, how you're coming across, what impact you're having on them. Often that stays unspoken. And then the last thing, which is kind of my favorite, is their most wild and crazy ideas. Their biggest ideas that could be game changers for you, for your team, for your organization, for your relationship, that people often withhold because they think, this might sound too crazy. I don't want to say this. So those four categories are the biggest things that I discovered are commonly withheld from us.
So now is a good time for us to then go into the approach. How would someone use the ask approach for people to feel comfortable sharing the information they're currently withholding?
Yes. So there's 5 practices that go in a sequential order of steps. of the ask approach. And of course, like any model, it's a little bit more messy than just 5. You might go back and forth between steps. But for simplicity, I'll lay them out in a list of 5 things. And the first one starts with ourselves. It's not even anything we say or do to the other person. It's something that happens internally to ourselves, which I call choosing curiosity. It's about actually wanting to be curious about what we don't know. It's about asking ourselves the question, what could I learn from this person? What might I be missing that I don't know? And so in the book, we talk about strategies for how to move from a mindset of certainty, because so much of the time we're just walking around in the world thinking, what is there to be curious about? I know how this person is. I know how this situation is. I know how this company is, et cetera. From that kind of certain mindset to a mindset of, wow, there's things I don't know. And when we realize there's things that we don't know and that we could learn something valuable from someone else, all of a sudden we get more curious, and that curiosity radiates outwards. When people actually sense that we're genuinely curious, that's the first thing that motivates them to actually want to share and engage with us. But often that's not enough. And so that's where number 2 comes in, which I call make it safe. It's amazing how often the people around us don't feel totally safe to tell us what they really think, feel, and know, especially if they feel like that's a hard thing for us to hear. Maybe they think we're going to have a bad reaction. Maybe they think we're going to judge them. Maybe they think that it's going to make them look stupid, like any number of different things. All of this gets really exacerbated across lines of difference, power, all of that just complexifies the whole thing. So whenever that's at play, you really have to lean into making it safe. And so in the book, we talk about creating connection and different ways to create connection, including meeting them on their terms, in their place where they're most comfortable, et cetera, including ourselves opening up, displaying the curiosity and the humility that we feel, and saying, here's why I'm really dependent on learning from you. Here's what I need from you, et cetera. And then another strategy I talk about under Make It Safe is called Radiate Resilience, which is really demonstrating to them that I can handle what you have to say. I'm not going to crumble if you say this to something important to me. I'm also not going to hold you responsible for my reactions as well. So all of that goes into Make It Safe. The third practice is called posing quality questions. And we all ask questions, but very few of us have had the opportunity to actually get trained in how to ask the right questions. And so we end up asking what I call crummy questions rather than quality questions. And crummy questions might be questions that are just clumsy, like you're asking 4 questions at once, and so the other person isn't really sure what you're asking, or you're asking sneaky questions that are trying to lead them to a certain answer or attacking them with questions. So all of those are crummy questions. And that's distinct from what I call quality questions. And the most important feature of a quality question is that it's designed to help us learn something from the other person. And so there's questions that can help us hear the headline view that they have, or dig deeper into where that view comes from, or see what they're seeing, or invite feedback or request reactions or their ideas. So there's a whole bunch of different quality questions, but questions are so powerful to unlock what someone really knows, thinks, and feels. And it's just, to me, I'm kind of a nerd about questions, and to me, it's amazing how one single question, just how it's composed and designed and worded, can unlock something that you would otherwise never know or discover. So that's number 3. The fourth is all about what happens after you ask the question. So it all comes down to how you listen to the answer. Can you hear what they're saying? Can you hear what they're not saying? And in the book, we talk about the importance of listening through 3 channels at once: the channel of the content of what they're saying, the channel of the emotion that they're conveying, and the channel of what actions they're actually taking. And so many of us are kind of geared towards listening to one channel more than the others. But if we can train ourselves to listen to each channel and then put it back together, we will literally triple the amount of information that we hear from people. And so we talk about strategies for doing that. And then the final practice I call reflect and reconnect, because once we actually listen to someone and hear what they have to say, whether we learn from it depends on how we process what they tell us. And so I talk a lot about reflection, which I think is a very high leverage thing for us to do, but often overlooked. Sometimes people think of reflection as like, that's what monks do on mountains and monasteries, and not actually what a leader can do. But you can break down reflection in very concrete ways to talk about ways to help it shape my actions and my thinking and my deeper mindsets. And then ultimately, once you reflect and really squeeze the meaning, that's how you convert talk into action, is through reflection, to ultimately close the loop and go back to the person, and reconnect with them and say, this is what I'm taking away, and thank you. And did I get the right takeaways? And closing that loop is so important, because people often are wondering, what did they do with what I shared? And should I do it again? And should I take that risk again? And so reconnecting matters for all of those reasons.
So much to unpack. Thank you so much for sharing the easy way for people to follow. So first question, finding time to be curious, because as you know, we live in this world where people have way more to do than they have time for. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, we can always be curious. So it doesn't take extra time to be curious. The same time we would spend being judgmental or certain, we can choose to be curious. And I talk a lot in the book about how curiosity is not just a state that you're in or a trait that you have, but it's an active choice that you can make. And I would argue that you can make that choice any moment of the day, even right now as we're talking. It's a choice of how curious am I going to be. So I don't think it has to compete with time, but I do also believe, and I talk about this in the book, that the pressures for speed and efficiency that we're all kind of grinding under can compete with curiosity, because it can just put us into a mindset of like, get it done, as opposed to a mindset of really what might I be missing here? And any number of life hacks that people can do to just momentarily slow down, whether that's taking a breath, or meditating, or taking a short walk, any number of those things, which honestly don't have to take a lot of time. That can happen, in 2 minutes, can have a dramatic effect on the mindset that we're in and create the spaciousness for curiosity.
What about anxiety? Do you find in working with leaders and helping them incorporate the ask method, do you feel that anxiety is another reason why people struggle to incorporate it, because they are under so much stress? It's just then another thing for them to focus on, and they don't have the capacity because of the level of stress.
Yeah. When we're emotionally hijacked, whether that's because we're anxious, or frankly, when we're upset or angry, or any number of strong emotions, that is one of the, what I call in the book, curiosity killers. Because it can just hijack us, and it can send us straight up to our most certain conclusions, our most negative, assumptions about what's going on. And so I think you're right. One of the things that I talk about in the book are ways that we can actually use our emotions as cues to become more curious. So if I can notice, I'm feeling really stressed right now, I'm feeling really anxious right now, and recognize one of the consequences of that is likely going to be I'm not as curious as I need to be, I can actually turn that anxiety into a way to help me become more curious, because I can say to myself, okay, this is the moment when I need to most be curious. To give you an example, I at work was feeling stressed and, I would say, frustrated by one of my colleagues at work at one point. And I went and talked with my co-CEO, Elon, about this. And I knew that because I was so frustrated and stressed, I was likely missing something. I was likely not being curious. And he, of course, was able to say to me, take your own medicine, and here's some things that you might be missing. And why don't you just kind of, walk yourself back down a little bit to be more curious? But it was because I noticed that I was able to do that. And I wasn't actually able to get myself into my curiosity zone all by myself. I talk about how curiosity is a team sport. Often when we're really stressed or anxious or really worked up, we need to get someone else to help us become more curious. But it can be a cue to ask for that kind of help.
Such a good example. Another example I immediately had popped into my head, that just asking yourself how another person would react to this situation. How would they view me?
Absolutely. Exactly. That's a perfect question to trigger curiosity.
So the next step is making it safe.
Yes.
Let's dive in. How would someone make it safe?
Yeah. Well, obviously, everything depends on the specific situation and the person, but there's 3 things to think about. First is, do I have enough of a personal connection with the other person to actually have them make it safe? And so, lots of people talk about, well, it's important to share things about your life or go out to lunch, and all of those things can matter, but it doesn't have to be that. I'll give you a personal example. I have a teenage daughter, and one of my favorite things to do is to hear about her day, what's going, what happened at school, etc. And if you know anything about teenagers, when they come home from school and you say, how was your day? Usually you don't get more than one word, which is fine. And so, but that's not, I'm not really learning what's going on for her. And so I have to ask myself the question, when and how do I connect with her? And as it turns out for my daughter, if I want to connect with her, I have to stay up really late. She stays up till 10 or 11 or past that, which is when I want to be asleep. But if I'm with her at that point in time, she really wants to connect. She wants to tell me about her day. She wants to tell. And so the question is, for whoever you're talking about, whether it's a client or a colleague or a boss or a manager, what are the terms on which they want to connect? Because that's what it's going to take for them to have that level of connection. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is opening up. And so I can't expect to make it safe for somebody else to share things with me that might be hard if I'm also not doing the same thing myself. If I'm not saying to them, here are some things that I feel vulnerable about. Here's some things here's some ways in which I need you. And so here's some mistakes I've made. Here's some things I don't know. I know for sure I don't know this. That kind of opening up can also really make it safe because it says to the other person, this is a human being. And just the same way I feel vulnerable, they also feel vulnerable. And so I can trust that more. And then the last one, which I alluded to earlier, is what I call radiate resilience. And that is really about letting the other person know I can handle what you have to say. It's not going to kill me. I'm not going to punish you for it. And that can look like things. For example, I had someone say to me, Jeff, if I were in your shoes, I'd really be frustrated. Is that how you're feeling? All of a sudden he's demonstrating to me, I can handle, I get it. If you're frustrated, I'm not going to be surprised by that. I'm not going to be upset by that, etc. And there's many other different tactics for how to radiate that kind of resilience. But when someone feels like you can handle what they have to say, you're not going to punish them or blame them. It becomes a lot safer.
Can we take a specific scenario that is very common for our listeners? Let's say they are senior manager or executive within a very large organization, and they are performing very well, and they want to be selected for a particular opportunity within the organization. And so making it safe needs to happen with someone more senior than them.
Yes.
What would be your recommendation in terms of how to apply what you're teaching to that situation?
Yeah, I really appreciate that situation. I agree that it's very common. And I've seen so many instances where people are not getting the advice from the senior person about really what they would have to do. And I think that plays out, and there's a lot of research that plays out in particular in ways that disproportionately affect marginalized groups as well, whether on race or gender or any other identity markers. And it's also a really interesting scenario because it goes to show that safety is not limited to someone who's more junior in a situation. In this case, you're trying to make someone more senior than you feel safe to tell you really what is the thing that I need to get better at. And so I would here's a few I think things people should think about. One would be to say to the other person, it's really important to me to know your most critical feedback. I don't just want to know what I'm doing well. I really need to know what I'm not doing well. And in particular, the things that I might not even realize that I'm not doing well, the things that people might not tell me. And so really putting it out there and naming that. Another thing would be to say, here are some of my own hypotheses and theories about what I'm not doing well. And I'd love to know from your perspective, do these resonate? And also, what am I missing as well? And then a third thing is sometimes people are just not going to feel comfortable saying a piece of critical feedback. And if you really sense that after you've tried all the other things that you've tried, it can be helpful to ask them for advice instead, to say, if you were in my shoes, what would be some things that you would be trying or be doing differently? And from that, you can begin to unpack and extrapolate what their critique might be. I tend to try to first prefer to ask for it more directly, but if you sense that you're really not getting it, sometimes people prefer advice over feedback.
This is incredibly helpful. Can we please look at one more scenario that is very typical?
Yes.
Let's say someone who is in management consulting, they're at the partner level and they have to meet certain sales requirements in any firm, even if in that firm, no one is talking about sales directly, you have to sell. So let's say they are communicating with someone who is a potential important client. In that scenario, what would you recommend?
So there's just to clarify, the scenario is how would you sell to that other person, essentially?
How do you make them feel safe?
In particular, how to make them feel safe. Yeah. I think the most important thing in that situation is to make it very clear to that person that you care about them and their success more than anything else, more than making the sale. And honestly, that might mean not making the sale. That might mean making the sale 6 months from now, as opposed to right now, because the moment that they start to believe that you are putting your own interest first, and that you're trying to get something out of them or sell something to them, etc., I think the barriers go up in terms of them actually trying to tell you what's really going on for you. And if you can't, fully put that aside, then I think the next best thing to do goes back to the strategy of opening up and being very transparent with them and saying, look, I'm trying to actually be as helpful to you as you can. Obviously, if we can be the ones to support you in this, that'd be a great thing from our perspective. But the most important thing to me is what's right for you.
So in that situation, it will be addressing potentially the biggest concern, whether the person is watching out, or whether the consultant is watching out for the client's interest.
Exactly. And really deeply trying to understand what that concern is, and before doing anything about trying to sell to it.
Keeping that same scenario, let's talk about quality questions. What would be a quality question in that type of situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first quality question would be a very simple one, which is, what's going on? Tell me about the challenge that you're seeing from your perspective, and not jumping in with saying, here's all my qualifications and here's why you should be talking to me and all that. But just, I want to know what's going on. And a very good follow-on question from that is, give me some examples. How is that playing out in your situation? And why do you think that might be going on? Really, what you're trying to do in all of these question strategies is understand the world from your potential client's perspective. And when people sense that you're really trying to understand the world from their perspective, they're more likely to continue to be sharing with you, because they think, gosh, they really want to understand me, as opposed to they want to get something out of me.
Very helpful. So now let's talk about listening to 3 channels. Maybe we
Yes.
can switch now and go back to the first scenario. So how would you listen to 3 channels in that conversation with a more senior person within the organization?
Yeah. So the first channel is the content of what someone's saying. These are the facts, the information, the words, etc. And I think for all 3 of these channels, one very powerful approach to use is what I call paraphrase and test. And this is a strategy that I didn't invent. I learned it from mentors at places like Action Design. But it's basically saying to the person, here's what I think I heard you say. Did I get that right? Or how, what did I miss? And so for the content of it, it would simply be to kind of say back in my own words. So what I think I'm hearing you say is that when I'm in collaboration meetings more, I need to make more airtime for someone else. Is that the right takeaway? Or is there something more that you were trying to say, etc.? So paraphrasing it and testing that back. The emotion channel is really more about the feelings that someone is going through and conveying. So let's say that, for example, that someone was saying, well, when you're with me, you cut me off a lot, or when you're with me, you're making me feel, devalued or whatever. Simply, so, the paraphrase and testing could simply be, gosh, I'm hearing, hurt or frustration in what you're saying. Is that the impact I'm having? Is there something different, et cetera? And really testing that. Or simply to say to them, what is the emotional impact of what I'm saying as well? So that would be something for the emotion channel. And then the action channel is really trying to figure out, what is the person doing in the situation? And so one way to do that is to say, for example, let's say somebody is really giving me a lot of critical feedback. I might say to them, what I think is going on here is you're actually giving me examples to help me see what I'm missing, so that you can be contributing to me getting better. Is that the right takeaway from what you're saying, et cetera? And so really trying to understand what's the intention behind the action, but also checking that and testing that with them as well.
And then the next one will be reflect and reconnect. Staying with that same scenario, how would you manage that step?
Yeah. So the first part of reflection is, well, actually, I talk about this approach called sift and turn. So the first part of it is sifting, because a lot of times when people tell us things, it's not all necessary to reflect on. And I don't want to send the message to people like, you need to obsess about every single thing that people say. And sometimes what people tell us is not valuable. Sometimes it's biased. Sometimes it's unhelpful. And so the first thing is to actually just spend some time listening to what someone said and to ask ourselves, what from this feels valuable and what from this can I sift out? And it's very helpful to get other people's perspective on that as well, especially if it was an important conversation, so that we're not accidentally sifting out things that are useful. So to talk to a friend or a partner or a colleague about that can be helpful to really sift through, all right, this is the most important stuff that I heard. And then there's a strategy that I just call turning it over and over again to really get the most out of it. The first turn is what I call the story level reflection, which is to say, what did I hear that affects the story I was telling myself about the situation? So for example, if in that first scenario, if my story was, I'm on the fast track to partner and I'm doing really well, et cetera. Maybe I heard something that complicated that story, which is I could be on that path, but I have these two things to be working on. Or I could be on that path, but I need to invest these three stakeholders who are critical decision makers as opposed to other people. And so really trying to enrich and enhance and nuance and complicate the story that I'm telling myself is the first step. The second is, what steps do I want to take based on that? So I want to reflect on what are the actions that I could be taking based on what I learned. Maybe the action that I need to be taking is asking other people for feedback, or maybe the action I need to be taking is literally changing my behavior based on the advice that they gave me. So that's the second, is what steps can I take differently? And the third is what I refer to as our stuff. That's the kind of deepest assumptions and beliefs and worldviews and ways of being that we have accumulated over our entire lifetime. And oftentimes, this is the most powerful thing to reflect on, because we can then apply it to many different situations. Maybe the stuff I need to look at is that I am too paranoid in certain situations, or maybe the stuff that I need to look at is that I need to have more confidence in myself. It could be any number of different things. But if we don't get to the stuff, the deep stuff level reflection, we might be changing our thinking, our behaviors in one situation, but our stuff will just show up in many other situations. And so that's the deepest level of reflection. We don't always have to do it in every moment, but if you really want to learn and grow the most from something consequential that someone has to offer you, you got to get to that level of reflection on your stuff. And that can take many forms, but go ahead.
I was just going to say it is so incredibly important to reflect and to sift and to determine whether something that was shared with you actually applicable. That's because right. It's very sad sometimes to see clients that are still negatively, severely impacted by something that someone told them many years ago that is not even true.
Right, right. But they didn't sift it out. And so they just took it in. Yes.
For someone applying the ask method in these two scenarios, what are the likely mistakes they may make and places where they may likely get stuck?
Mm-hmm. It probably varies based on each of the 5 practices of the ask approach. But I think that let's take quality questions, which is number 3. I think one of the mistakes that people can make is to go so far in the direction of asking questions that they're not also sharing their own views as well. And so the ask approach is not trying to send the message that the only thing we should do is ask questions. I actually built the ask approach because it comes out of a perspective called action science, which emphasizes the importance of both telling and asking questions. But my observation was that most people do a lot more telling than asking. And so I wanted to rebalance the scale by writing the book about asking questions. But if you swing too far towards asking questions and you don't actually tell what you're thinking as well, people will stop trusting you because they're thinking you're not actually sharing, or they'll stop finding you valuable, et cetera. So I'd say that's probably one of the biggest pitfalls that I would encourage people to avoid.
Could we do the same for each step? Because I think it is very valuable.
Absolutely. So if I go backwards to step 1, which is choosing curiosity, and say, what's a common trap that people could fall into in choosing curiosity? I think the trap is they think they're getting curious, but they're not really asking a big enough question of themselves. They might say, yeah, I think here's my opinion of this person, and I guess I could be a little bit more curious as to why they're such a jerk. But they're not asking themselves the real curious situation, which is, are they actually a jerk, or is there a different way of situation? So, I would say it's kind of it would be applying curiosity too narrowly, as opposed to really stepping back and saying, what is my story in this situation, and are there totally different stories that I could be thinking about as well?
I have an interesting quote that I recently heard. Someone said that what really hurts us in life is not what we know, but what we think we know, but it's actually not so.
Exactly. I love that quote. It's a beautiful illustration of not being curious, and also the consequences to ourselves of not being curious as well. So if we were to then talk about pitfalls someone might fall into in terms of trying to make it safe for the other person, I mean, at some level, I would say you probably can't overstep in trying to make it safe, because safety is a good thing. Um, and we often underestimate how much safer people need to feel. But I suppose that if you're working so hard to make it feel safe for the other person, you might unintentionally be sending them the message, I don't think you feel safe. And unintentionally sending them the message, I need to inoculate you against what you might fear are my reactions. And that could have its own negative consequence on its right. So I think you do need to gauge how far you go. And the best way to gauge is to check, out loud, like, how comfortable are you feeling talking about this, and what concerns do you have about talking about this, etc. But if you swing it too far on any of these strategies, I think it can be problematic.
Jeff, what has been the most surprising or most powerful insight you've uncovered by asking the right questions?
Wow. There are so many. Let me think about, I mean, I have uncovered, in my own efforts to, sell, or in my case, fundraise, I have uncovered concerns that people have about what I'm selling or my own organization that they never would have told me. So, for example, I remember sitting down at a meal with some of my current funders of Transcend and just saying to them, I'm really interested to know, you see a lot of organizations, you have a different vantage point than I do. What concerns do you have about our organization? Is there anything you think we could be doing better? And they were completely surprised that I would be asking them that question, because they would not be expecting me to want to take the conversation to a place of concerns. But of course, if someone has a concern, you're not implanting that concern in their mind. They have it; they're just not telling you. And so they shared with me some of their issues with our strategy that I had no idea was something in their mind. And that led to a very rich conversation that allowed us to, allowed it both for me to learn from that and to really think about that, but also for me to clear up some misconceptions that they were having in the strategy as well. So that's one example. And then I think other kinds of things are just when I have asked somebody, what impact do I have on them? How has my behavior impacted them? And I learn that there's some way in which I've unintentionally frustrated or hurt or made their lives more difficult or created a barrier that I had no idea that I was doing. It's painful to hear that, but I'm so glad to find out, because then I can actually try to repair it and do better next time.
For our listeners who have teenage children, do you have any questions that work well with teenagers?
Well, what's interesting? I think a lot of parents don't ask their own children, what could I do differently as a parent? What would make me a better father, mother, parent for you? And teenagers have a lot of opinions on that particular question. And I don't think you actually have to reserve that for teenagers. That could be a question that you could ask any child or any family member. And I think that a lot of us would be very surprised by what we hear from that.
The next question I wanted to ask you, if you could share an instance where a seemingly simple question led to a major breakthrough in an organization.
Sure. One of the things that I deeply believe is that organizations have collective genius inside of them, that people who work in organizations at every level and in every position in the organization have ideas and observations that if you could actually add them up all together, are incredibly valuable. But in the vast majority of situations, that is dormant because people don't share that. It's not activated. And so I love thinking about the question of how do you activate the collective genius of a team or an organization? I remember in my previous organization, I was in a management situation where my team and I had instituted a set of policies that got implemented throughout the field of the organization. And so, we had hundreds and thousands of people implementing our policies. And what we started to notice was that in our health surveys, morale was going down. Performance was actually improving, but morale was going down. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to care about both, performance and morale. And so we set up a process, and the policies had to do with how people were setting goals and managing to goals. And so we set up a process where we actually brought together people of every level of the organization, and we just laid out the data, and we said to them, here's what we see going on, and here's what we're worried about. And we think that some of our own practices and policies are getting in the way. Could we go through some discussions where you help us see how are these things playing out in your life? Why are they causing you problems? And most importantly, what would you do differently if you were us? And the ideas that got shared included things like, yes, it's important that we set goals, and yes, it's important that we track measures, but what we really are motivated by is the vision that we have for what we're trying to do. And so what if we could actually articulate, the purpose that we're trying to go after, as well as the metrics and goals, so that we could be in dialogue with our managers about both, since we know that the metrics and goals are only partially able to capture what we're trying to go after. And all of a sudden, the creativity skyrocketed, morale started to turn around, energy came back, and none of that would have happened had we not actually just asked for the answer from people. And some of that, I think, was because they came up with a much better idea than we could have thought of. But some of it was because they were asked and they were involved and they were part of the process as well. And that alone creates a totally different level of energy.
Jeff, we spoke about creating a sense of safety in one-to-one situation. What strategies do you recommend for creating a culture where employees feel safe to share their genuine thoughts and ideas?
Absolutely. I think the first thing that comes down to is what is the behavior that's being modeled by leadership of the organization. And I personally believe that leadership can and should be exerted by every single person in an organization. I don't think leadership is limited to a single title, but people who are in positions of authority have a special influence on impacting the culture. And so one of the things, we have a chapter in the book that's all about how do you weave this into the culture of an organization. One of the things that we talk about is that the leader needs to be the learner in chief. And so that means literally being the one who is admitting that they don't know things, who is asking more questions than anybody else, who is reflecting not just privately but publicly, and saying, "Here's what I've heard. Here's how I changed my views. Here's how I grew, etc." That can be just so incredibly powerful in terms of setting the tone. Other things also include hiring practices. So in the first job that I was hired for in a consulting organization, I didn't know it at the time, but they were hiring for curiosity and people who were interested in feedback. And the way that they tested that was by giving each candidate critical feedback at the end of the interview to see how they reacted. And were they going to get defensive or were they going to get curious? Were they going to be receptive to the feedback or not? So who you hire for makes a big difference. But then I also believe that organizations can build capability in this stuff, just the same way that I think the ask approach is learnable. People can read the book. People can go through trainings. People can give each other feedback on how well they're doing these kinds of things as well. And then the last thing I would just say is like, even in everything that gets kind of rewarded, gets reinforced in organizations. So in performance management and performance evaluation and feedback settings, et cetera, if this is something you value, make that something that gets specifically made explicit and talked about, even evaluated.
And the next question is, how can leaders strike a balance between asking for honest feedback and ensuring they are not perceived as indecisive or lacking direction?
Yes. I think a lot of it has to do with that final step when I call reflect and reconnect, because reflecting and doesn't mean you're agreeing with everything that someone says, or taking it in. And so if you can go back to your team and say, here's the feedback I heard, here's what I'm going to implement and why, and here's what I'm choosing not to implement and why. I don't think that's at odds with asking a lot of questions. I think that the indecisive part is, or weak perception is if you're just asking questions, but you're not actually saying what you really think. Or if you're just asking questions and literally doing 100% of what other people tell you. But if you're asking questions and then you could show people, I've sifted through what you said and I have a reflection on it, and some parts I agree and I don't, I think that can be a way to strike the balance.
And if someone who is listening to us now wanted to apply the ask method at home with their spouse, would there be any recommendations from you on what they should do a little bit differently in personal relationships?
Well, it's interesting. There's a lot of research that shows that we're not very good at knowing what people in our life are actually thinking and feeling, but we're actually even worse at knowing what our spouse is thinking and feeling. And some of that is because we think we know our spouse so well, because maybe we've been with them for a long period of time, and so we become overconfident. So I don't know that I would say that it has to be any different, other than to say, I think especially if you're with your spouse, you can let them know that you're trying this. It's always better to be sort of explicit. Hey, I'm trying a new thing. I want to hear from you more. I want to actually be a better listener, than to just do it and not let them know that you're trying to do that. So that'd be the one thing that I would say. But I would say I think this is incredibly important in personal relationships too.
And another delicate balance we have to maintain is between asking probing questions, but without crossing into intrusive territory. What would be your thoughts on that?
I do think that you have to be very mindful of that. There is interesting research that shows that a lot of times people welcome questions that we think might be too sensitive. And so sometimes we don't ask enough questions because we presume that someone wouldn't want to be asked about that. But I think especially in the workplace, it's important to be thoughtful about that. And one way to do that is actually to ask a question about your question. As I say, please let me know if this is a topic that you don't want to talk about or that you're not comfortable about, or is this something that you're interested in talking about? And that can be a way to be able to gauge, is this territory that the other person wants to go to or not?
You can read the body language. You can see things on people's faces, the way they look at you. You can just even sense the energy.
Absolutely, you can.
How have you seen the dynamics of power play out in the willingness of individuals to share or withhold information?
Yeah, it's very important. In my own experience, when I became a manager of bigger teams, I underestimated the ways in which the power of my position made people not feel safe to share with me. And honestly, that was one of the biggest motivators for me to do this learning and ultimately to write this book. And so anytime somebody feels that you have power over them, and that could be formal hierarchical power, that could be relational power, that could be personal power. There's all different kinds of power that people could have over you. If someone feels that you're likely to use that power in ways that could punish them or threaten them, they are far less likely to share what they're really thinking and feeling if they think it might upset you or expose something bad about them. And so the ask approach, I think, becomes especially important in situations where there are power dynamics. And in particular, the step called make it safe it is especially important there.
And then we cannot have this conversation without talking about AI and how it will impact people. So maybe we could touch on how do you think it will impact our ability to ask questions and our ability to be curious and generally our ability to be great leaders?
Yes. I mean, such a fascinating question. I'm thinking a lot about that right now. The first thing I would say is that AI is taking over a lot of functions that people played, even in functions like strategy roles as well. We certainly use AI as it relates to helping to synthesize information and build arguments, all that kind of stuff that I know I used to get paid and other people get. So the question, one question is, what is uniquely human in an age of AI? And I don't think computers will ever truly be able to connect with other human beings or tap into or learn from other human beings in the ways that we can do that. And so I feel like something like the ability to learn from others, something like the ask approach, is one of the most human things that we can be doing, one of the most important things that we can be getting good at when AI is getting better than us at many other things. I also think that I have found that AI can actually help us get better at this. And I write about this in the book a little bit. I put into ChatGPT, I have this and that opinion about this political figure. I think they're terrible. And then I write one more thing, which is, what might I be missing? And all of a sudden, what comes back from ChatGPT is a whole different set of stories than I was entering the situation with. And what I love about that is that it's very safe to do that. We don't have to expose what we know to other people. We literally, in the privacy of our own screens, can simply say that one question: what can I be missing? What might I be missing? And AI can help us get more curious. I've also said to AI, here's an argument that I had with my wife. What are some good questions I should ask her? And similarly, AI can generate questions, questions that I never thought to be asking, that all of a sudden help me have a much better conversation. And then, we talk about listening. AI can actually help us listen through those three channels. If you take a transcript of a conversation, which is now very easy to get because we use AI to get transcripts, and feed that into AI, and you say, can you summarize for me what was the content of what someone was saying? You can get that. Can you summarize what was the emotion they were conveying? Can you summarize what actions were they taking? It's amazing. And of course, it's not perfect, just like we wouldn't be perfect, but it's really a way to kind of check what we're hearing against another kind of perspective as well. So I'm very excited about the ways in which AI can help us do this better.
The last question from me today is, in the last few years, what were 2-3 aha moments, realizations that really changed the way you look at business or at life?
Yeah. I would say, I think one of them is why I wrote the book, which is the aha that there's so much that I'm not hearing from other people. And I sadly, and also I think thrillingly, have that all the time when I'm discovering, wow, I didn't find out until what this person was really thinking. Wow, this client had an amazing idea that I hadn't heard before. Like, that to me is the central insight that was so powerful that really motivated me to write the book. And then I think other insights probably just are maybe at a more personal level as it relates to, just what really matters in life. And my kids now, I mentioned my teenage daughter, they're growing up fast. And so the insights of just how fast it all goes by and how precious the time is something that I'm really, I'm very present to right now.
Jeff, where can our viewers, listeners learn more about you, buy your book, anything you want to share?
So the book is called Ask, Tap into the Hidden Wisdom of People Around You for Unexpected Breakthroughs in Leadership and Life. They can find that book anywhere that books are sold. If they want to learn more about the Ask approach, the website is www.askapproach.com. And if they want to find out about the organization that I co-lead called Transcend, that's transcendeducation.org.
Jeff, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you for being here and for everything that you have shared. We had such a great conversation with a lot of important things that people can take away. And I really enjoyed it as well.
Me too. Thank you so much for having the conversation with me as well. I really enjoyed it. And I loved all the questions that you asked.
Thank you. And for everyone watching and listening, our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It is a free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And it is firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And if you need to improve your resume, get McKinsey and BCG winning resume, which is a resume that got offers from both firms. Go to firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to connect with you all at the next session.